I'd always considered myself a simple man. I worked hard, came home to my wife, and tried to build a life that was honest and solid. My name's Tom Fisher, a 39-year-old foreman at the local steel mill. I'd been married to Linda for 13 years. She was the love of my life, or at least, that's what I believed. Our house was modest, a small 2-bedroom tucked away on a quiet street where the neighbors waved at you in the mornings. Linda worked at the town library, and she had this way about her, soft-spoken, always smiling. The type of woman who made you feel lucky just to be around her. But something had shifted over the past few months. At first, I chalked it up to her being tired. Her hours at the library had gotten longer, or so she claimed. She'd come home late, saying the head librarian needed help with some project. I believed her, because why wouldn't I? Linda wasn't the kind of woman who lied, or at least, I thought she wasn't. One night, I came home to find the house quiet. Normally, Linda would be in the kitchen, humming along to the oldies station on the radio while she cooked. But the kitchen was dark, and the air felt off. When she finally walked in, hours later, her explanation didn't sit right. "Late meeting," she said, avoiding my eyes. "Mrs. Peterson's retirement party is coming up, and I stayed to help organize." Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and for the first time, I noticed she smelled different, not her usual vanilla perfume, but something sharp and musky. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe the library's air freshener had changed, or maybe I was imagining things. But doubt crept in, slow and insidious. It wasn't just the late nights. Linda started dressing differently. She swapped her usual cardigans and sensible flats for tight jeans and low-cut tops. She even started wearing makeup to work, something she hadn't done in years. When I asked her about it, she brushed me off with a laugh. "Oh, Tom," she said, patting my cheek like I was a silly child. "A girl likes to feel pretty now and then. Don't read into it." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woman I'd shared a life with was pulling away, and I didn't know why. One night, after another of her late shifts, I decided to stay up and wait for her. I sat in the living room, pretending to watch TV, but really, I was listening for the sound of her car. She walked in just after midnight, her hair a little too neat, her lipstick smudged. She didn't notice me at first, and when she did, her face went pale. "Tom? What are you doing up?" "Couldn't sleep," I said, my eyes locked on hers. "Where were you?" She hesitated, a split second, but it was enough. "I told you, at the library." Her tone was sharp, defensive. That was the moment I knew. I didn't have proof, not yet, but my gut told me Linda was hiding something. For the first time in 13 years, I didn't trust my wife. And that realization hit me harder than a punch to the gut. After that night, the cracks in our marriage felt more like gaping holes. I wasn't the kind of man who jumped to conclusions, but once doubt worms its way in, it doesn't let go easy. Linda carried on like nothing had changed. She'd kiss me on the cheek in the mornings, pack my lunch the way she always did. But I noticed things now, things I'd ignored before. Like how she'd disappear into the bathroom for half an hour after work, door locked. Or how she'd angle her phone away from me, swiping out of messages quick as lightning if I glanced over. I told myself I was being paranoid. Linda wouldn't do this to me. To us. But the feeling wouldn't let go. One evening, I got home earlier than usual. I'd swapped shifts with Frank, one of the younger guys at the mill, so I could catch a game on TV. As I pulled into the driveway, I spotted Linda's car parked out front, but something made me kill the engine and sit there a minute. Through the living room window, I saw shadows moving. I told myself she was probably just cleaning or talking on the phone, but my gut told me different. I stepped out of the truck quietly, easing the door shut so it wouldn't slam. The front door was unlocked, which wasn't unusual. But the second I walked in, I knew something was off. The faint smell of cologne hung in the air, not mine. Something sharper, heavier. I stood in the entryway, listening. Laughter. A low voice. A man's voice. I froze, heart thudding in my chest so loud I swore they could hear it from the other room. I stepped carefully toward the kitchen, my boots barely making a sound on the hardwood. From the other side of the door, I heard Linda's voice, light and playful. It had been a long time since she talked to me like that. "Tom could walk in, you know," she said, laughing softly. "He's working late," the man replied. His voice was too familiar, but I couldn't place it. I pushed the door open without knocking. Linda was leaning against the kitchen counter, sipping a glass of wine, smiling at someone seated on the other side of the island. She gasped when she saw me. "Tom!" The glass nearly slipped from her hand. She set it down quickly, brushing her hair behind her ear. "You're home early." Her eyes darted to the man sitting in my kitchen like he owned the place. It was Mark Landry, my oldest friend. "Mark!" My voice came out steady, but my hands were trembling at my sides. "What are you doing here?" Mark shifted awkwardly on the stool, scratching the back of his neck. "Linda invited me over. We were just catching up. I figured you'd still be at work." "Catching up. Right." I glanced at Linda. She wouldn't meet my eyes. "Didn't know you two were so close," I said, voice tight. "We aren't," Linda cut in quickly. Too quickly. "He was just helping me with some things around the house." That was the excuse she landed on. Pathetic. I forced a smile, though every inch of me wanted to drag Mark out by his collar. "Helping, huh?" "Yeah, fixing the sink," Mark said, standing abruptly. He grabbed his coat off the back of the chair. "It was leaking. I should probably get going anyway." I stepped aside as he walked past me, but I didn't miss the way his eyes darted nervously to Linda as he left. The door clicked shut behind him, and suddenly it was just the two of us. Linda turned to the sink, rinsing her glass like nothing had happened. "Fixing the sink?" I asked, leaning against the counter, arms crossed. "Don't start, Tom." I let the silence stretch, watching her closely. She wouldn't turn around, just kept scrubbing that glass until it was practically see-through. Finally I spoke. "Is there something you want to tell me, Linda?" She stiffened, but her voice was cold when she answered. "You're overreacting. Mark's an old friend. You're acting like a jealous teenager." Jealous. Maybe. But I wasn't stupid. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I want the truth." "You have the truth." She spun around, eyes blazing. "You're imagining things, Tom. Mark was here for 10 minutes to fix the sink. That's all." Maybe she believed that lie if she said it enough. I nodded slowly. "All right." I pushed away from the counter, grabbing my keys off the hook by the door. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Back to work." "Tom, come on." I didn't wait for her to finish. The door slammed behind me, and I climbed into my truck, hands shaking on the wheel. As I pulled out of the driveway, Mark's car was still parked just down the street, engine running. He hadn't left. That was the moment I knew. Linda was lying. And Mark was more than just an old friend. I didn't go back to the mill. I didn't go anywhere. I parked a few blocks away at the old gas station that hadn't sold gas in over a decade, killed the engine, and sat there, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Mark Landry. Of all people. We'd grown up together, played on the same little league team, even stood side by side at each other's weddings. He'd been the best man at mine. And now he was sitting in my kitchen, drinking my wine, smiling at my wife like he owned her. I watched the street from the gas station, eyes fixed on the familiar shape of Mark's old blue pickup. He was still there. Neither of us left. Good. I was a patient man. I could wait. An hour passed before Mark finally pulled out, driving slow like he was waiting to make sure I wasn't going to double back. Smart. He'd always been good at covering his tracks. But I'd learned how to follow a trail. I eased the truck into gear and kept a good distance behind him. I wasn't even sure what I expected to find, maybe proof, maybe nothing. Maybe just the satisfaction of making him sweat. Mark drove past Main Street, out toward the industrial part of town near the train yards. I figured he was heading home until he pulled into a familiar spot. The bar behind Baker's Auto, the one that didn't bother putting up a sign because everyone in town already knew it. I parked across the street and watched him disappear inside. The smart part of me said to go home, talk to Linda, and figure this out like adults. But the other part, the part that was boiling over, won out. I walked into the bar, scanning the room. Mark was sitting in the far corner, nursing a beer like nothing was wrong. His eyes caught mine the second I stepped inside. His hand tightened around the bottle, and I saw his throat bob as he swallowed hard. I didn't break eye contact as I crossed the room. "Mind if I sit?" I asked, not waiting for an answer. I dropped into the chair across from him. Mark glanced around, no doubt checking for exits. "Tom, look, man. Relax," I said, leaning back. "I just want to talk." He didn't. That much was obvious. I waved over the bartender and ordered a beer, taking my time while Mark squirmed. "Wasn't expecting to see you tonight," he said finally, trying to sound casual. "Yeah, well, either was Linda." He stiffened, eyes darting to the side. That was the crack I needed. "You want to tell me what's going on?" I asked, voice calm but low. "Or do I have to drag it out of you?" "Nothing's going on," he said too quickly. "Linda called me over. The sink was leaking." I laughed under my breath. "You're handy all of a sudden?" "I know how to fix a damn sink." I stared him down, letting the silence hang. "Funny thing is, I checked the sink before I left. Not a drop." Mark shifted in his seat, fingers tapping against the bottle. "She tell you I'd be home late?" I asked. "She mentioned it, yeah?" I leaned in. "Why don't you tell me the truth, Mark? Man to man." He froze. For a second, I thought he might come clean, admit it, apologize something. But instead, he put the bottle down and straightened his shoulders. "You're imagining things," he said coolly, the same words Linda had used. I smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "Right. I'm imagining things. Like how you've been around more often, or how Linda's been working late when there's no overtime at the library. How you're parked down the street even when I'm home." Mark's face paled. I had him. "I'm not stupid," I said, standing up. "But I'll give you some advice. Stay out of my house, Mark. Next time, I won't be so polite." He stayed seated as I walked away, probably weighing his options. I hoped he'd be smart and take the warning. But men like Mark don't quit that easy. As I stepped outside, the night air felt heavier, like the calm before a storm. I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Linda was in the kitchen when I got home. The place smelled like lasagna, but I wasn't hungry. My appetite had disappeared somewhere between the bar and the drive home. She didn't hear me come in at first. I stood in the doorway watching her hum softly as she stirred sauce on the stove, swaying slightly like she didn't have a care in the world. It pissed me off. "Smells good," I said finally, stepping further into the room. She jumped, ladle slipping from her fingers and clattering into the pot. Tomato sauce splattered across the counter. "Jesus, Tom. You scared the hell out of me." I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You all right?" Linda wiped her hands on a dish towel, not meeting my eyes. "I didn't expect you back so soon. Thought you were pulling a double." Switched with Frank. Her jaw tightened, but she forced a smile. "Well, dinner's almost ready." I watched her carefully, letting the silence stretch between us. She hated silence, always filled it with chatter or the radio or the TV. But now, she just focused on scraping sauce off the counter, her back to me. "I ran into Mark," I said, testing the waters. Her shoulders stiffened, just for a second, but it was enough. "Oh?" she said, pretending to be nonchalant. "Didn't know he was out tonight." I almost laughed at how bad she was at lying. "You didn't?" She shook her head, dumping the towel into the sink. "No. Haven't seen him since he fixed the sink." There it was. That damn sink lie again. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "It's funny, Linda." Mark said the same thing. But when I checked earlier, the sink was fine. Not leaking. Not even a drip. Her hands froze on the counter. For a long second she didn't move. Then she turned around, finally meeting my gaze with narrowed eyes. So what are you saying, Tom? Her voice was cold now. That I'm lying to you? I held her stare. I'm saying you're hiding something. She folded her arms, mirroring me. And you think it's Mark? Jesus, Tom. He's your friend. Was. Her eyes flickered, and I caught it, just a flicker of guilt before she masked it with anger. Mark's been helping me with things because you're never around. You're always at the mill. You come home exhausted, barely talk to me. What am I supposed to do? Sit here and stare at the walls? That's not an answer, I said, stepping closer. You and Mark. Is there something I should know? She let out a bitter laugh. You're paranoid. I can't believe this. I could feel the heat rising in my chest. Then why won't you just say no? She stared at me, her lips pressed together in a thin line. For the first time in 13 years, I realized she didn't care if I believed her or not. And that hurt more than the lie. I'm done with this conversation, she said, brushing past me. I grabbed her wrist, not hard, just enough to stop her. Linda. Look at me and tell me the truth. Right now. She yanked her arm free, eyes flashing. I am telling the truth, Tom. If you don't trust me, maybe that's your problem. I let her go, watching as she stormed off down the hall. The lasagna sat there bubbling in the oven, but the house felt cold. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe I'd let jealousy twist something innocent into something ugly. But my gut told me otherwise. Linda wasn't telling the truth. And if she wouldn't, I'd find it out myself. The next few days felt like living in someone else's skin. I kissed Linda goodbye in the mornings, listened to her hum while making coffee, and pretended everything was fine. But it wasn't. Every word she spoke felt like nails on glass. I could hardly look at her without picturing those messages, the winks, the same time next week. I couldn't stop seeing her with him. Mark Landry. The man I'd trusted with everything. I watched them closely, waiting for cracks in their act. Linda was careful, too careful. She stopped bringing up Mark's name altogether, like she could erase the evidence by avoiding it. But I knew better. Cheaters don't stop. They just get smarter. So I got smarter too. It was late Thursday evening when I set the trap. Linda was in the shower, her phone left unattended on the counter again. I didn't need to look through it this time. I had a different plan. I opened the Find My iPhone app and linked her phone to mine. Now I could track her whenever I wanted. I felt a twinge of guilt as I watched the spinning wheel connect the devices. But that faded quickly. She'd crossed the line first. I was just leveling the playing field. By the time she stepped out of the bathroom wrapped in a towel, I was back on the couch, flipping channels like nothing had happened. You're quiet tonight, she said, drying her hair. Long day. She smiled, kissed my forehead, and walked to the bedroom. I watched her go, feeling like a stranger in my own home. Soon enough, she'd feel the same. Friday night. Linda told me she had a book club meeting. Funny thing was, she'd never been in a book club. I nodded like I believed her, kissed her goodbye at the door, and watched from the window as her car disappeared down the street. As soon as she was gone, I pulled out my phone and opened the app. There it was, her little location dot, heading straight toward the other side of town. Not to the library. Not anywhere near it. I slipped into my truck and followed the signal. Linda's dot stopped outside the Hillcrest Inn. I parked across the street, gripping the steering wheel so tight I thought it might snap. The Hillcrest wasn't some fancy hotel. It was the kind of place couples went when they wanted to avoid running into someone they knew. I waited, heart hammering in my chest. And then I saw her. Linda stepped out of her car, wearing a black dress I hadn't seen before. She smoothed her hair, glancing nervously around. I didn't have to wait long to see who she was meeting. Mark pulled in moments later. He walked right up to her, placing his hand on her lower back as they disappeared into the lobby together. I sat there for hours, long after I saw the lights flick on in one of the rooms. I could have stormed in right then, thrown the door open and dragged Mark out by his collar. But that wasn't the kind of revenge I wanted. I didn't want to end it that night. I wanted to burn their little secret to the ground. I stayed in that truck for hours, watching the second-floor light flicker behind thin curtains. My knuckles ached from how tight I gripped the steering wheel. I'd driven home after the worst shifts of my life and never felt this empty. By the time Linda's dots started moving again, the sky had gone dark, and the neon vacancy sign flickered like some cheap joke. I watched her leave. She smoothed her dress, hair messy in that way you only get from being under someone else. Mark followed 5 minutes later. Casual. Like he wasn't sneaking out of the Hillcrest Inn with another man's wife. They didn't leave together, too careful for that. Linda headed back home, probably thinking I'd be asleep when she walked in. Mark drove the opposite direction. I didn't follow Linda. Not yet. I followed Mark. He drove straight home. No detours. No quick stops at bars to down a guilt-ridden beer. Mark pulled into his driveway, humming along like a man who had nothing to lose. I parked half a block down and watched him unlock his front door, completely unaware I was sitting there, watching his every move. The funny thing about Mark? He'd never been afraid of getting caught. He always believed he could talk his way out of anything. That's what pissed me off most. When the front door shut behind him, I sat there and thought about all the ways I could ruin him. The old me would have walked right up to that house and knocked until his smug face answered. I would have laid him out on his front porch without a second thought. But that wasn't enough. I wanted to make Mark sweat. I wanted him to feel the walls closing in slowly until he broke under the weight. By the time I got home, Linda was already in bed. She left the kitchen light on, like she always did when I worked late. A plate of reheated lasagna sat on the counter, wrapped in foil, but I wasn't hungry. I stood in the doorway to our bedroom, watching her sleep. Her phone sat on the nightstand, buzzing faintly with a new message. I didn't even have to look. I already knew it was him. I turned off the light and shut the door behind me. Let her sleep peacefully. It would be the last time she did. Saturday morning felt like a test. Linda kissed me goodbye as I left for the mill, brushing flour from her hands like she was playing house. "Don't forget we're having dinner with the Wilsons tonight," she said, smiling like she hadn't snuck around the night before. "I won't forget," I replied, kissing her cheek. As I pulled out of the driveway, I watched her in the rearview mirror. She waved from the porch, the perfect wife. By the time I hit the main road, my mind was already running ahead. I had a plan. Mark thought he was clever, but he forgot the one thing you should never underestimate. A man willing to lose everything has nothing left to fear. That night, I walked straight into the Hillcrest Inn's front lobby. The clerk barely glanced up from his phone. "Help you with something?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, sliding a 50 across the counter. "I need to know who stayed in room 207 last night." He hesitated, but the 50 made his decision for him. "Couple checked in around 8. Guy named Mark Landry. Paid in cash." I smiled. "Thanks. Keep the change." I didn't need proof anymore. I just wanted confirmation. The last piece of the puzzle slid into place. When I walked into our house that night, I felt calm. Linda was setting the table, wearing a dress I'd bought her for our anniversary 2 years ago. She smiled when she saw me, leaning in for a kiss. I let her. "Rough day at the mill?" she asked sweetly. "Same as usual," I replied, pulling out a chair. She sat across from me, sipping wine like nothing had changed. But I knew something she didn't. Tomorrow morning, Mark Landry's wife would receive a thick manila envelope on her doorstep. Inside? Every single message I pulled from Linda's phone. Screenshot. Highlighted. Dated. And a little note from me. "I thought you deserved to know the man you married." The envelope was delivered by hand, first thing Sunday morning. I wanted to see the moment it hit Mark's doorstep. I parked 2 houses down and watched from the comfort of my truck, sipping burnt coffee from the gas station. Mark's wife, Annie, opened the door just after 8 a.m. She bent down, picked up the package, and held it like she already knew something bad was inside. She didn't open it right away. I could see the hesitation in the way she turned it over in her hands. Good. Let the doubt start early. I watched her step back inside. The curtain shifted slightly a few minutes later. She wasn't curious, she was terrified. She should be. I spent the afternoon working in the garage. Linda stuck her head in a few times, asking if I needed anything, playing the role of doting wife. I waved her off with a smile that probably looked as fake as it felt. By evening, I still hadn't heard anything. No calls. No frantic knocks on the door. I figured Annie might have waited until Mark came home to confront him. But as the sun dipped low, Mark's number finally lit up my phone. I let it ring. Twice. Then a third time. Voicemail. I listened to the message as I wiped my hands clean of motor oil. Tom, listen. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but we need to talk. Call me back. Please. Please. Funny how quickly the tough guy act crumbled. I didn't call him back. Not yet. Instead, I cracked open a beer and watched TV with Linda. She curled up next to me like nothing had changed. She laughed at sitcom reruns. Held my hand during commercials. I wondered if Mark was doing the same, or if he was out on the street begging Annie not to toss his ass to the curb. I pictured his face when he finally saw those screenshots. The texts about sneaking off next week, and can't wait to see you again. I wondered if she slapped him first, or packed his bags right away. That thought made me smile. Monday morning, Mark cornered me at the mill. I was tightening bolts on one of the furnaces when I saw him coming. His steps were heavy, like he wanted me to hear him. Tom. I didn't look up. Mark. He leaned on the nearby workbench, hands trembling against the steel. I know it was you, he said quietly, keeping his voice low so the other guys wouldn't hear. I straightened, wiping sweat from my brow. You sure about that? She's leaving me, Tom. His voice cracked, just a little. Annie packed up the kids this morning. I shrugged. Not my problem. He slammed his fist on the bench. You didn't have to ruin my life. I met his eyes for the first time. You ruined mine first. His mouth opened, but no words came out. What could he say? He knew he was caught. We stood there for a long moment, just staring at each other. Finally, he exhaled sharply and backed away. I guess I deserved it, he muttered. Yeah, I said. You did. He left the mill early that day. By the time I got home, Linda was sitting at the kitchen table. She had her phone in front of her, the screen still lit up. She didn't look at me when I walked in. How was work? I asked, setting my keys down. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned the phone toward me. There was an email open. From Annie. Subject, your husband and mine. Linda's eyes were red, like she'd been crying. Care to explain this? She asked, voice trembling. I crossed the room slowly, sitting across from her. Nope, I said, folding my hands on the table. I think it explains itself. She stared at me, searching for some kind of regret or guilt. But there was nothing to find. I leaned forward, locking eyes with her. I warned you, Linda. You just didn't listen. Linda's hand trembled as she placed the phone down on the table. She sat stiff, like she was bracing for a car crash that hadn't quite happened yet. How long have you known? She whispered, eyes fixed on the email. I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed. Long enough. She blinked hard, swallowing whatever excuse she'd been about to offer. Good. I didn't need to hear it. Was it Mark? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. Yeah. Him and that damn sink you thought needed fixing. Her face twisted, somewhere between guilt and frustration. I wasn't. Don't. I cut her off, shaking my head. I've heard enough lies to last me the rest of my life. Just don't. She looked down at her lap, twisting her wedding ring around her finger. I wondered if she even remembered the day I slid that ring on her hand. Or if it all blurred together with whatever she and Mark were doing at the hillcrest. After a long silence, she finally spoke. So what now, Tom? I let the question hang. I'd thought about this moment over and over. Dreamed of flipping the table. Yelling. Storming out. Maybe tossing her clothes on the lawn for good measure. But now that it was here, I felt calm. You tell me, I said. You're the one who broke this. Her eyes flashed, sharp as knives. Don't act like you're innocent. Spying on me? Tracking my phone? You could have talked to me, Tom. But you went behind my back. I almost laughed. The audacity. I went behind your back? I repeated, leaning forward. Linda, I didn't start sneaking around motels with my old friends. You did. So let's not pretend this is about me being paranoid. Her face flushed, but she didn't deny it. She couldn't. I watched her squirm for a few seconds before standing up, grabbing the keys from the counter. I'm staying at Frank's tonight, I said. You've got time to figure out what the hell you want to do with this marriage. Linda's head snapped up. You're leaving? I paused at the door, turning slightly. No. You left first. I'm just catching up. Frank's couch was lumpy as hell, but I slept like a rock. He didn't ask many questions. Just handed me a beer and let me sit in silence. That's what real friends do. The next morning, I woke up to 10 missed calls from Linda. I ignored them. I wasn't in a rush to go back. But I did. I pulled into the driveway just past noon, expecting some dramatic confrontation, tears, screaming, maybe even some packed bags by the door. What I found instead surprised me. Linda sat at the kitchen table, pale as a ghost, phone clutched in both hands. When she looked up, her face wasn't angry. It was scared. What's wrong? I asked, setting my jacket down. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She just handed me the phone. I glanced at the screen. Unknown number. I know what you did. Mark isn't the only one who's going to pay. I reread the message twice before looking back at her. Who sent this? Linda shook her head. I don't know. I frowned, scrolling through her messages. Nothing else stood out. Probably a prank, I said, setting the phone down. But Linda didn't look convinced. Her hand rested on her stomach, like she was trying to steady herself. Tom, I think Mark's wife might be dangerous. I almost laughed. Annie? Please. She's too sweet for that. But the look in Linda's eyes told me she wasn't joking. She's been calling me. And last night, I think someone followed me home. That got my attention. Why didn't you say anything? I asked. Linda shrugged helplessly. Would you have believed me? She had a point. I sighed, rubbing the back of my neck. All right, I said. I'll handle it. I'll talk to Annie. Make sure she's not, losing it. Linda nodded, but the tension didn't leave her face. Neither of us realized the worst was still coming. I left Linda at home, still pale and jittery. As much as I wanted to be indifferent, something about that message didn't sit right. Annie Landry had always been the quiet type, soft-spoken, polite, the kind of woman who baked cookies for church raffles. But grief does strange things to people. And betrayal? That twists the knife in ways you don't see coming. I pulled up to the Landry house just after 2. Mark's truck wasn't there. Good. I wasn't ready to deal with him yet. Annie opened the door almost as soon as I knocked. Her eyes were bloodshot, but she wasn't crying. She looked focused. Tom. She nodded, like she'd been expecting me. Annie. Got a minute? She stepped aside without a word, leading me to the living room. The house smelled faintly of bleach, like she'd been scrubbing the place down for hours. I sat on the couch, but Annie stayed standing, arms crossed, staring at me like I was just another piece of trash she forgot to take out. What's this about? she asked, though her tone said she already knew. I didn't bother dancing around it. Linda got a message. Someone threatening her. Mentioned Mark by name. For the briefest second, something flickered across her face. But she recovered quick. I don't know anything about that. I studied her closely. Annie, listen. I get it. Mark's a son of a bitch. He wrecked both our marriages. But if you're thinking of doing something... She laughed. A sharp, humorless sound. Oh, I'm not doing anything, Tom. She leaned in, lowering her voice. I already did. I sat up straighter. What the hell does that mean? Annie's eyes locked onto mine, cold and sharp. You think I'm the only one who got those texts? She pulled out her phone, scrolling for a few seconds before shoving it in my face. Unknown number. I know what he did to you. He's going to pay for it. I frowned, reading the message twice. When did you get this? 3 days ago. The day after you sent that little gift to my doorstep. I rubbed my jaw, feeling the edges of something darker creeping in. So, if it's not you, who is it? Annie stared at me for a long time before shrugging. Maybe someone else Mark pissed off. You think you're the only husband he screwed over? The thought hadn't crossed my mind. I wouldn't lose sleep over it, Annie added, her lips curling into a thin smile. If Mark's smart, he'll start looking over his shoulder. Maybe this town's had enough of him. I stood up, feeling more unsettled than when I walked in. As I left, Annie called after me. Tell Linda to sleep with one eye open. Someone's always watching. The following day, Mark's truck was vandalized. I drove past his place on the way to work and spotted him standing in the driveway, staring at 4 slashed tires and a windshield spiderwebbed with cracks. Linda's name was keyed into the side of the driver's door. I pulled over, stepping out of my truck. Mark didn't say anything as I approached. His face was tight, lips pressed into a thin line, like he was holding back from punching the hood. You think this was me? I asked, nodding toward the damage. Mark shook his head. No, he muttered. I don't. We stood in silence for a long minute. Annie? I guessed. Maybe. I don't know anymore. I almost told him about the messages. About the unknown number. But I didn't. Let him sit in it. Get out of town for a while, Mark, I finally said, turning back toward my truck. Yeah? He laughed bitterly. And leave Linda for you? I stopped at the driver's side door. Linda's not the prize you think she is, I replied coldly. You two deserve each other. Mark didn't have a comeback. I drove away, watching him shrink in the rearview mirror until he was nothing but a speck in the distance. That night, I told Linda everything. I laid out the messages, the vandalism, Annie's cryptic warnings. Her face went pale as I spoke. Tom, this is getting out of hand, she whispered. I nodded. Yeah. And it's not over yet. She gripped the edges of the kitchen table, knuckles white. What do we do? I didn't have an answer for her. Because whoever was behind this wasn't done with either of us. 2 days passed, and things almost felt normal again, like the eye of a storm right before the winds ripped the roof off. Linda tiptoed around me, cooking more than usual, keeping the house spotless. She thought if she acted like the perfect wife, maybe I'd forget everything. But you can't clean away guilt. Not when someone's out there dragging it to the surface. The messages stopped, but the tension didn't. I checked our locks twice before bed and slept with a bat next to the nightstand. Linda didn't ask why. Maybe she already knew. By Wednesday evening, I started to believe whoever had sent the threats moved on. Until I heard the knock at the door. I opened it, expecting Mark or maybe Annie ready to scream at me on the porch. Instead, I found the sheriff. Gray beard. Boots worn from years of pacing the town streets. Sheriff Owen Walsh had been around since I was a kid, too stubborn to retire. Evenin', Tom, he greeted, rocking slightly on his heels. I frowned. Sheriff. What brings you by? His eyes flicked over my shoulder, where Linda hovered near the kitchen entrance. Mind if I come in for a word? Linda tensed, but I nodded, stepping aside. Sheriff Walsh walked in, hat tucked under his arm. He took a seat at the kitchen table without waiting for an invite. I sat across from him, and Linda poured him coffee, her hands shaking slightly as she set it down. "Everything all right?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The sheriff stirred his coffee slowly, watching me with that unreadable gaze only men like him have, the kind that made you feel guilty even if you didn't know why. "You and Mark Landry been having some trouble?" he asked finally. I glanced at Linda, who'd gone pale. "Not really," I replied. "Just personal stuff." Walsh nodded slowly, setting his spoon down with a soft clink. "Well, personal or not, someone slashed his tires and carved your wife's name into his truck." He leaned forward. "I don't suppose you had anything to do with that?" Linda stiffened beside me, clutching the counter. I met Walsh's gaze without blinking. "No, sir. I was home all night. Linda can tell you that." She nodded quickly. "He was. Didn't leave the house." Walsh's eyes shifted between us, like he didn't quite believe it. "All right," he said after a long pause. "Figured I'd ask." He reached into his coat pocket and slid something across the table toward me. It was a photo. A blurry one. Mark. Standing outside our house at night. Linda gasped softly, covering her mouth. "Security camera across the street caught him last night around 11, Walsh said. "I reckon he didn't knock for a friendly visit." I studied the photo, heart thudding in my chest. "He didn't come inside," I muttered. "I'd know. Maybe," the sheriff said, standing. "But I'd keep an eye out. Men like Mark don't like to lose." Linda was trembling by the time Walsh left. "Tom," she whispered, looking at me like she might break apart right there in the kitchen. "It's fine," I said, setting the photo down. "I'll handle it." But Mark wasn't the one I was worried about. As I stood by the window that night, watching the street like a hawk, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was out there. Not Mark. Not Annie. Someone worse. The phone buzzed on the table behind me. Unknown number. "I saw him at your house too. He's not the only one watching." I stared at the message for a long time. Then I locked the door. I didn't tell Linda about the message. No point in making her panic more than she already was. She barely ate dinner. Kept pacing the living room, peeking out the blinds like Mark was going to lunge out of the bushes at any second. But Mark wasn't the problem anymore. That unknown number? That's who I was worried about. I sat on the front porch that night, smoking a cigarette I found tucked away in the garage. I hadn't smoked in years, but the weight of it felt right between my fingers. I scanned the street, watching shadows stretch under the streetlights. Mark's truck wasn't there. But someone was. Across the street, parked half a block down, headlights off, an old, dark sedan. I could barely make out the shape behind the wheel. I didn't move. Just sat there, flicking ash into the wind. Whoever it was. They didn't move either. We stared each other down through the dark. "Fine. You watch me, I'll watch you." By morning, the car was gone. I didn't sleep. Just sat by the window all night, the bat leaning against the wall. When Linda woke up, I told her I was heading out early. "Where?" she asked, watching me tie my boots. "To find Mark." I didn't call ahead. I found him at the scrapyard where he worked part-time. His truck was parked near the back fence, tires still slashed. Mark sat on the tailgate, smoking like the world owed him something. He looked up as I pulled in, narrowing his eyes. "Come to finish the job?" he sneered, nodding toward the wreck of his truck. I ignored the jab. "Who's the other guy?" Mark flicked ash onto the gravel. "What other guy?" "The one parked outside my house last night." His smirk faded. "Don't play dumb, Mark. I know you saw him." For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Just stared at the cigarette burning between his fingers. Finally, he spoke. "I thought he was with you." I took a step closer. "What the hell does that mean?" Mark shrugged, eyes darting to the side. "He's been around. Following me too." Thought maybe you sent someone to mess with me. I shook my head. I don't need someone else to do that. He laughed bitterly. Yeah. Guess not. I stared him down, waiting for more. But Mark just looked tired. Who is he? I asked again. I don't know. Mark admitted, voice quieter this time. But whoever he is, he knows more than we do. Maybe Annie's involved, maybe not. But he's not done with either of us. I felt that truth settle deep in my gut. Mark finally flicked his cigarette away, watching the ember glow in the gravel. Tom, you ever wonder if we're both just pawns in someone else's game? I stared at him, then back at the empty road behind me. Yeah. I was starting to wonder that too. When I got home, Linda was sitting at the kitchen table. Another message lit up her phone. I grabbed it before she could. Unknown number. You should have told him the truth. Now he'll find out the hard way. Linda's eyes widened as I set the phone down slowly. Tom, what does that mean? She whispered. I looked at her, heart pounding. I don't know, I said. But I sure as hell was going to find out. By the next morning, that dark sedan was back. Same spot. Same driver I couldn't make out through the glass. I stood at the window, watching it like a guard dog watching the gate. Linda hovered behind me, twisting her hands like she wanted to ask what I planned to do. I didn't answer. Because I didn't have a plan. For the first time in this whole mess, I was flying blind. Whoever was behind the messages, they weren't after Linda anymore. They were after me. And I'd be damned if I let them win. By noon, I was standing outside the sedan. I walked right across the street, straight to the driver's side window. Whoever this was wanted to hide. Wanted to lurk in the shadows. Not today. I rapped twice on the glass. All right, I said loud enough for them to hear. Come on out. Let's do this face to face. For a second, nothing happened. Then the window rolled down, slow and deliberate. I expected Mark. Maybe Annie. But it wasn't either of them. It was Owen Walsh. The sheriff. He sat there, sunglasses perched low on his nose, arms crossed over his chest. Morning, Tom, he greeted casually, like we were standing in line at the grocery store. I blinked. Sheriff? He smiled. You expected someone else? I glanced around, suddenly feeling like an idiot. What the hell are you doing out here? Walsh leaned back in the seat, pulling his sunglasses off. Following a lead, he said calmly. What lead? Walsh's eyes narrowed slightly. You. I took a step back, crossing my arms. Why the hell are you following me? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he gestured at the passenger seat. Get in. I didn't trust him. But I got in anyway. The second the door shut, Walsh reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to me without a word. I opened it, my eyes scanning the words. It wasn't a message this time. It was a police report. My name sat at the top. Linda's too. What is this? I asked, feeling my stomach twist. Filed anonymously last week, Walsh said, watching me closely. It claims you've been threatening Linda. That she's afraid of you. I laughed, shaking my head. That's bull. Linda wouldn't. It wasn't Linda. I froze. What? Walsh's expression darkened. We traced the email that filed it. Came from a burner account. But guess who it's connected to? I didn't answer. I didn't have to. I already knew. Mark. I clenched the report so tight the paper crumpled. Tom, Walsh said carefully, his voice lowering. I get that Mark screwed you over. But this thing, it's spinning out of control. Someone's gonna get hurt. I nodded, but I barely heard him. My ears were ringing too loud. Mark was trying to set me up. He wanted me to snap, wanted the sheriff breathing down my neck so that when something did happen, I'd be the first one dragged away. I should have expected this. Let me handle it, Walsh said, almost like he could hear my thoughts. I forced a breath, nodding slowly. Yeah. Sure. But the second I got out of that car, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. And the next move? It was mine. I didn't go home after my talk with Walsh. Instead, I drove straight to Mark's place. His truck was parked in the driveway, tires still flat from the slashing. Fitting. I knocked hard, twice, before pushing the door open. Mark! I called out, stepping inside. The house was quiet. I took a few steps into the living room. The air felt stale, like he hadn't opened the windows in days. Empty beer cans lined the coffee table. I spotted him through the sliding glass door, sitting on the back porch with his head down. He didn't look up when I stepped outside. You hiding, Mark? I asked, voice cold. Sheriff showed me the little report you filed. Cute trick. Mark exhaled through his nose, flicking his cigarette into the grass. I didn't file anything, he muttered. Bull. He finally looked at me, dark circles under his eyes. The smugness was gone. You think I've got time for this crap? He said quietly. I've been sleeping in my truck half the week. I narrowed my eyes. Why? He rubbed his face. Annie kicked me out. I tried to fix things, but... I stared at him, but he wouldn't meet my gaze. So what? I asked. You thought you'd wreck my life since yours is already circling the drain? Mark leaned forward, gripping the edge of his knees. Tom, listen to me, all right? He finally locked eyes with me. There was panic there, real panic. I didn't file the report. And I sure as hell didn't send those messages to Linda. I folded my arms. Right. Just like you didn't sleep with her. Mark winced. I screwed up. I know that. But this isn't me. I didn't say anything, but something about his tone unsettled me. He was scared. Who then? I asked after a long silence. Mark shook his head slowly. I don't know. But whoever's doing this, they're not after me, Tom. I frowned. What the hell does that mean? He stood, walking to the porch railing. He stared out at the empty yard, rubbing his jaw. Annie, he muttered finally. She's not as sweet as you think. I felt something cold crawl down my spine. Annie. She filed it? I asked, my voice tight. Mark nodded. I think so. And if she did, she's not done. I swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing into my chest. I'd been looking at the wrong person this whole time. I didn't stick around to hear more. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun was already dipping behind the trees. Linda met me at the door, eyes searching my face. What did Mark say? I didn't answer. Instead, I gently pushed past her, locking the front door behind me. Tom? She pressed, following me into the kitchen. I grabbed the bat I'd left near the back door and set it against the wall by the table. Just stay inside, I said, my voice flat. Linda's eyes widened. Tom, what's going on? I finally met her gaze. It's not Mark we need to worry about. Linda didn't ask questions after that. She knew better. She stayed close that night, sitting quietly by the window, sipping tea that she didn't touch. Her eyes flicked toward the street every few minutes, as if expecting someone to step out of the shadows. I sat at the kitchen table, watching the front door. The bat leaned against the wall beside me. By midnight, the house was dead silent except for the faint ticking of the old clock by the fridge. Linda finally spoke, her voice soft and trembling. Tom, what if she's dangerous? I didn't answer right away. I didn't want to admit I'd been asking myself the same thing. She's just pissed, I said, not quite believing it. Once she cools off. There was a knock at the door. Linda stiffened, eyes wide. I grabbed the bat and stood slowly, motioning for her to stay back. Another knock. Louder this time. I took a breath and opened the door. Annie Landry stood there, soaking wet. Her hair clung to her face, rain dripping from her coat. She smiled. Hi, Tom. I didn't move. Annie. What are you doing here? Her eyes drifted past me, to where Linda stood just out of reach. "Can I come in?" she asked. "No." Her smile faded, replaced by something colder. "I just want to talk," she said softly. "That's all." I gripped the bat a little tighter, feeling the weight of it in my palm. "You've done enough talking," I replied. Annie's gaze flickered toward the bat, and something in her eyes shifted. For a split second, I thought she might lunge. Instead, she took a slow step back, raising her hands like I was the one who'd lost it. "All right," she said. "I'll leave." Her voice was calm, but her eyes never left mine. Before she turned away, she said one last thing. "I hope you sleep well tonight." I watched her walk down the driveway, disappearing into the dark. Linda's voice trembled behind me. "Tom, she's not done." I shut the door and locked it. "I know." Neither was I.